Today's Wednesday, January 16th. David, welcome back.
Hi, Jason. Good to be with you.
I'm really pleased that we've been able to create this additional show. You and I are now doing basically 2 shows per week, which is quite a schedule to keep up with, but there's so much information that you're constantly bringing forward. I think it's important that we remind people, David, that every Friday at normally around 1 p.m. Eastern, you and I are doing a show that's available exclusively to our Patreon supporters. And of course, people who are watching right now on patreon.com/crowdsource the truth. I always like to encourage our viewers to also go and visit patreon.com/reverse CSI storyboards. That's David's page, of course, and couldn't be doing this show without David. It's very important that people support David on Patreon. I know there's been this dust up with question about First Amendment rights violations by Patreon. And you know, David, you were the first person to bring it to my attention, or to suggest rather, that we should consider that Patreon may in fact want to do the right thing, but someone else could be influencing them. And you know, since you've said that, David, I've been watching Jack Conte's Twitter feed. Jack Conte, of course, is the CEO of Patreon. And you know what? I would have expected him to have made some sort of a public statement about this situation. It happened maybe the first week or the second week of December, and Jack Conte has been virtually silent. I found him to be a very thoughtful and nice guy when I met him at PatriCon there in Los Angeles. So I'm surprised he hasn't said anything. I think, David, that actually strengthens your hypothesis that perhaps he and his company are being forced to do something that he doesn't necessarily agree with.
And some people would call that extortion, right, including myself. It's legitimate to laugh, but perhaps I detect a little bit of nervosity. If you go into the mechanism by which the United States in general, or the Department of Justice in particular, can extort silence or false confession from people, you have to realize they've got some extraordinarily powerful mechanisms to do that, including organized crime groups. Actually, in the prison system, that back in 1984 got a huge opportunity to execute crimes outside the prison system through the sister of Field McConnell by the name of Christine Marcy. And of course, what she did in 1984 is she bought a Boeing, I can never remember whether it's a 757 or whatever, it's irrelevant, with money I think she stole from the Department of Justice Asset Forfeiture Fund for, I think back then it was called the United States Marshals Prisoner Transportation System, effectively creating, right through to this day, with I believe up to 150,000 prisoner flights every year, a mechanism for delivering a snuff film crew to a remote site, quite possibly overseas, and bring them back into jail, and all she would need is, or they would need, is a 48-hour furlough. So there's a lot of silence and a lot of dogs that are not barking out there in the community, and I don't assume that these people are not barking simply because they're corrupt or incompetent or disingenuous or whatever. I think what's far more likely is one of the most efficient racketeering organizations ever to be created, embedded inside your Department of Justice and its equivalent in the United Kingdom. Over to you.
Well, it's interesting that you say that, David. I mean, this is a theme that we've been over many times. You know, I was reminded recently that El Chapo, the Mexican drug lord, is actually incarcerated right here in New York City, not very far from where I am right now. There is some sort of, you know, penitentiary or something in downtown Manhattan, actually very close to where the World Trade Center is. And El Chapo is there, among others. I don't know if that's, we haven't spoken much about El Chapo. Perhaps worth investigating. You know, and this won't be really the focus of our conversation today necessarily, David, but I think something else to think about along the lines of the deep state is the ongoing confirmation hearing of the individual who, by all measures, certainly seems like he will be the next U.S. Attorney General. I'm talking about this guy, William Barr. Have you heard much about him there in Canada, David?
He's supposed to be defending the integrity of the Mueller investigation, I believe, and
yes,
under no circumstances will he cancel it. Now, but anyway, I think you're right. If we want to get back to little Jonbenet Ramsey, but I think I'd like to just make one more point, or perhaps several, about this organization that is nicknamed Con Air, or the United States Justice, Prisoner, and Alien Transportation System. So from 1984 right through to the present, I think Christine Marcy, Phil McConnell's sister, has been able to merge the strategic objectives of criminal gangs within the prison population, like the Aryan Brotherhood. And maybe you could just pull up the Wikipedia entry or something on the Aryan Brotherhood, and you'll see what business models they use to maintain control of the prisons through fear and contract killing. One of them is inmate prostitution. And the organization that I believe Christine Marcy set up in 1994 with the help of the Clinton administration, known as DOJ Pride. Now what that means is DOJ Pride represents the LGBT interests or community in the, excuse me, the FBI, the United States Marshal Service, Bureau of Prisons, Office of Justice Programs, Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearm, and Explosives, and a Drug Enforcement Agency, which of course would be of interest to El Chapo, and the United States Attorney's Office. So I think I've made many references to why does the LGBT community and all those components of the Department of Justice need some kind of special representation or protection. I think it's because they need alibis for a joint venture with criminal groups within the prison system for murder for hire and mass casualty events around the world. Now, if you look at the techniques or the economic models that they use, the Aryan Brotherhood, let's say operation and affiliation, it includes inmate prostitution. Now, I don't know whether the Aryan Brotherhood invented the idea of inmate prostitution, but what that would mean, presumably, if the guards were of a certain sexual orientation and the prisoners wanted favors from the guards, including ability or help in escaping, then maybe the prisoners, through their criminal organizations, could offer sexual services to the guards, right, which might result in an early release or maybe an escape. Now, Christine Marcy, go ahead.
I just wonder if the guards would be interested in doing that. I think there's a lot of disease among prison inmates. A guy named Sean Atwood has a channel detailing his experiences in prison, and he seems to indicate that so many of the attacks involve the transmission of hepatitis C. I mean, I presume anything is possible, but I don't know. Would guards want to engage in sexual activity with prisoners? Maybe so.
Anyway, back to little Jonbenet Ramsey. There is this extraordinary ransom note, which I think would be very unwise for most kidnappers or ransomers to write, A, because it would take quite a while to write 3 pages or nearly 3 pages, and B, because there is a signal being sent with that ransom note, rather self-congratulatory, that they seem to believe that they're immensely powerful. And if you look, I think on that second page down the bottom, it says, we are familiar with law enforcement countermeasures and tactics. Now, that's not written by some degenerate street person who might like raping and killing little girls, right? Neither would it, they give this an amount of $118,000 as the amount of the ransom, which corresponds to the bonus paid by Lockheed Martin directors to Jonbenet's father, Jonbenet Ramsey, who at that time was a chief executive officer of Access Graphics, which was installing Sun Microsystems and support systems in the Pentagon, specifically, I believe, at the Pentagon's U.S. Navy Command Center. So this is a fascinating ransom note, I think, for would-be sleuth, because it points, for me, directly back to the perpetrators. And then I would say, why would the particular nature, the horrific nature of the torture killing of the little girl, signed off as victory, exclamation mark. And I say to people, well, what kind of victory is it for an organization representing a small foreign faction to garrote, sodomize, taser, and smash the skull of a little girl? It's way above anything that I think a normal human being would consider appropriate, or perhaps most people in the prison system, who my belief is, many of them are mothers or fathers, etc., and they understand the joy of having children and the importance it is of looking after them. So this is a very interesting murder, unique. When I saw some of the details, I said this is perhaps a more significant murder for the United States of America than the assassination of JFK, which might perhaps seem a little odd. But let me just look at you see those two scorch marks on her skin?
Yes.
Many people have said that's a taser, right, which shoots 50,000 volt into the body of someone, which may not be enough to kill her. And what I'm coming to is, I think the Jonbenet Ramsey murder is one example of a global timestamp put on the death of someone who has been subjected to betting through what I believe is called a dead pool. Now let me just talk about tasers. Around the time of her death, which was Christmas Day of 1996, the taser had been developed and taken off the list of weapons, and of course I presume alcohol, tobacco, firearms and explosives, which was a member of the DOJ Pride organization, said, or I believe their ruling is, if you don't have an explosive driving the needles with the 50,000 volts, but you have a compressed air cartridge, it's no longer a weapon. So any guesses who would have been what the first organization would have been to receive taser equipment with compressed air cartridges? Any ideas, Jason?
Maybe U.S. Marshals?
You got it, right? You see what discovery is? So who was in charge of the U.S. Marshals at the time of her death? Christine Marcy.
At the time of Jonbenet Ramsey's death.
Yes.
Yeah, and that's why I brought up El Chapo, David, because it's U.S. Marshals that are operating that prison downtown in New York City.
Right, and if he's transported from A to B and B to A, if it was desired by the people who run this global Deadpool operation, which I think is Serco, that man would be able to escape, right? So that's the great danger of, I don't know if sexualizing is the word, but basically taking the Department of Justice and giving special concessions and privileges to people inside the system based on their sexual orientation. Now remember the Jerome Lemelson prisoner tracking, it talks about essentially the distribution or withholding of privileges through the use of artificial intelligence expert system and fuzzy logic algorithms, in which I happen to be an expert, having actually built a working system in the 1980s. But what kind of privileges would you offer to the Aryan Brotherhood if the people did what they were told on the basis that one of their preferred economic models is inmate prostitution? Why not give these characters, 24 or 48 hours furlough to go and rape, sodomize, torture and kill a little girl and come back with a snuff film? Now, what else happened to that little girl? And this, I think, is a clue that there is an organization run by Serco on behalf of dark forces within the international financial community, including NM Rothschild and Sons, that is obliged to put a global timestamp on what is known as the money shot, that is the time of death of a particular victim, in order that the party that actually bet on that particular time scoops the pot, and there are no arguments with the other bettors. In England, we call them punters. Do you have the phrase punter in the United States?
I've never heard it. Maybe on a football team.
Punter, yeah, I used to play rugby, and I used to punt around and that sort of thing. But a punter in the UK is someone who bets at the dogs or the horse races or whatever, or cockfighting or dog fighting or whatever. So you put your money on the line with a bookkeeper or
All
bookmaker.
that stuff is illegal, right?
That's very interesting. You should mention that, because Starnet Communications, that was raided in Vancouver on the 20th of August 1999, was engaged allegedly in hardcore pornography, child pornography, and online gaming in 60 countries.
But not dog fighting and stuff, right?
Oh, come on, Jason. I mean, I know you maybe in New York you haven't seen a dog fight, neither have I, but there's dog fighting, cockfighting. If people can bet on anything, there's human beings fighting each other to death.
True.
There are various places in the world that are not as civilized, if that's the right term, as New York, okay? And remember, this is a global operation, right? So when you take MH370 and disappear it and crash MH17 in eastern Ukraine, I can guarantee you there are people betting on the time of death of the proximity fuse caused by the proximity fuse missile that took down MH17, but I digress. So then you have the garroting of the little girl. Now, so that would tend to choke her, but wouldn't give a precise time of death, because maybe it's a bit like the Shermans in Toronto. Those two poor people, they were hanged side by side, incredible brutality in their home in Toronto by the swimming pool, by men's belts. So they were writhing and in agony, or part of it psychological agony, because the spouse was beside them dying at the time. It's quite possible these people would have been measuring the vital signs of either the husband or the wife, and started the betting on the length of time it would take for the partner, the spouse, to die, right? So there are people out there, Jason, who bet on anything, and death is a favored target and candidate. And if you go through the betting book of White's Club in London, the oldest, most aristocratic club in the world, they say, you have a betting book where there's an entry, I think it's 1811 or 1814, where one lord or aristocrat bets another a certain number of guineas, and something along the lines that a bet that Captain Maxwell will be killed in the affair of Her Majesty's ship Celeste if a Chinaman dies as a result of whatever. So death pool betting is a long established routine, and White's is very interesting, as you know, because Nicholas Soames, the grandson of Winston Churchill, was the Minister of Defence in the UK from 1994 to 1997, and his brother Rupert Soames is the Chief Executive Officer of Serco, right, which has access to the precision clock at the National Physical Laboratory that would allow Serco, if it had the appropriate connections to other patterns, to place a global timestamp on the time of death of a particular candidate, ranging from little Jonbenet Ramsey to any one of the high-value targets in New York on 911, including Peter Gansey, the New York fire chief, right, or Carlton Bartels in the Cantor Fitzgerald office at the top of the North Tower, or John O'Neill, the security officer for the Twin Towers. So what we're dealing with, I think there's a public perception these are kind of random events by some dark forces. Actually, they're highly orchestrated and synchronized and coordinated events by probably one of the most ruthless racketeering groups engaged in murder for hire and global extortion the world has ever seen. And I'm saying that Serco, right, the British outsourcer. So now, why having done whatever they'd done to this little girl, where what would appears to be a woman sitting on the steps outside is busy scribbling this 3-page ransom note, which is absurd when you think about it. There's probably a couple of men who garroted, tasered, and sodomized the little girl. But what they'd been paid to do, I believe, was to kill her at a particular second. And the way they did that was smashing her skull. And the crack was almost completely around, and there was a hole in it. And if you had a camera that was able to put a date stamp, and that's pretty trivial technology, I mean, you've operated cameras before, you could get a precise time of the death of that little girl. Now, how dramatic would it be if you made that midnight on Christmas Day? Right? That would convey quite a message, A, to the parents, if they saw that, and I think they probably did, but more particularly to the directors of Lockheed Martin at that time, which included Lynn Cheney and Norman Mineta. And we talked a little earlier about Patreon people, or at least I did, possibly being extorted. And I'm saying, well, do we see any odd behavior from Lockheed Martin after the murder of Jonbenet Ramsey? And I think we do. There is a patent that I think I've sent you a copy of, which was invented or originally assigned to Lockheed Martin. I think that was somewhere in February or March of 1997, and then reassigned. So the current assignee is British Aerospace. Now, I find that very weird, because if I look at that description of that patent, that is a highly strategic patent that goes back to my theory that the pedestrian walkway across the road from the atrium, the Winter Gardens atrium, into the World Trade Center complex, which had that banner, www.quebecnewyork.com.
Yeah.
They were getting organized, that group of people, which would have included improv artists, script writers, camera crews, etc., to put on an event at that ballroom, and I can never remember the name, Rose something or other.
Roseland Ballroom.
Roseland Ballroom, which I think seats about 3,200 people. So it must have been huge. On the 21st of September. So 11th of December to the 21st of September, that's a 10-day gap. So it's quite a considerable gap, even if you're doing marketing, to put that odd banner outside the World Trade Center that was prominent, if you had the camera in the right position, during the attack of 9/11. And it's a bit like the ransom note, in my opinion, of Jonbenet Ramsey, because what the people behind it are saying is, well, this is our signature. Instead of SBTC, which was signed off Small Business Theater Club on the ransom note, it's QuebecNewYork.com, which is a group of radicals in Quebec. And there are people in Quebec, I can tell you this, are not your friend, Jason. I mean, they're not America's friend.
You've said that.
Yeah, I would say it's the equivalent of Illinois. It's a gangster state, or a mobbed up state. And Illinois, remember, has got that key interesting position on the Federal Bridge. And I think the Federal Bridge, actually, it's got a covert message here, because I think you can buy rights to join the Federal Bridge or get kicked off the Federal Bridge, depending on behavior. But when you sign up to the Federal Bridge and you're a fully fledged member, you get a fiber optic link to the other members, which means you can do what in the financial world is called front running. Are you familiar with that term?
I think it's got to do with having even a very, very slight advantage in timing over most other people, so that you can place trades and make money on fractions of seconds.
You got it. And in order to do that, you need a very accurate clock, and the most accurate clock in the world. Now, whether it's the most accurate clock compared with other clocks, let's say it was the first most accurate clock in the world, the cesium fountain clock in the National Physical Laboratory in Teddington, where it was invented around the 1954 period. And in 1994, when Christine Marcy formed DOJ Pride, the most accurate clock in the world was placed in the custody of Serco. So the National Physical Laboratory in Teddington was outsourced to Serco in many ways, just like your United States Patent and Trademark Office is outsourced to Serco, and your US National Visa Center was outsourced to Serco. Am I missing something here, Jason?
What do you mean?
Well, why
They
was
run
America...
everything.
Well, exactly. They run the United States Defense Ammunition Center, 52 contract towers, right? They've installed fiber optics and defense red switch network on some of your major aircraft carriers. I mean, why don't you just shut down Congress and Senate and hand it off to Serco and its shareholders, which include the government of the United Kingdom, Saudi Arabia, and Singapore, a couple of pension funds for the elite intellectuals, like the teachers in the United States and the university people in the UK, the state of California, and 10 global custodians. I mean, it's absurd. And that's what I say. I think I'm getting too old to worry about whether being considered arrogant. I know, and I think I've shared that with you, we know where the plug is. If you want to drain the swamp, Mr. Trump, talk to Jason Goodman, right?
I can't seem to get him on the line, David.
Well, maybe he should be, because as the alligators close in on him, I mean, I think he thinks, I've got to be careful here, he's smart in certain ways, but I think he's a puppet when it comes to the restructuring of debt around his organizations going back to, let's say, 1988, when he bought Trump about 30 Boeing aircraft for Trump Shuttle Inc. I think you told me that you flew on one.
Yeah.
And the money that he needed to buy it, because people don't invest in Trump, they lend money to him in the expectation of getting it back later with an appropriate reward. In the case of the $380 million loan, that was put together by Citibank or Citigroup.
Yeah.
Right? And Citigroup used to be on the Federal Bridge together with Wells Fargo. And Wells Fargo was the master servicer for the leveraged lease on the Twin Towers, which means, and it picked up that status in about 6 weeks before the towers came down, and promptly arranged through Willis Faber and Lloyd's underwriters to double the insurance on the two buildings, so that in the event of both of them coming down on the same day, which from an insurance event would seem like a minuscule chance, because no steel frame building has ever collapsed through fire until 9/11, when 3 did, right? So it's coming back to the Federal Bridge. I think the Federal Bridge operates on the principle of a pay-to-play, which the Soviet Union, through the Marxist years, and probably in communist China, it's the same. You pay for certain privileges. Mm-hmm. So I believe you buy your way onto the Federal Bridge, and what you're given then are fiber optic links for operations around the world, which allow you to do front running on interesting events, which might change the value of shares dramatically, such as Nortel Networks, which went from $120 a share down to zero, and 5,000 patents migrated south towards Apple and Microsoft, with one of the directors of Apple being Al Gore. And you see, with that fiber optic links, now you're one step ahead of the people who are using satellite communications, because there's actually a delay in satellite communications. So when I saw that patent, the one that went from Lockheed Martin to British Aerospace and went through the details. Now, do I fully understand all the technicalities? I think I'm too old, but I get the gist of it. And what they're saying is, with that time division multiplex technique, they can use isochronous frames to, and I think the phrase is bit spreading a message to a receiver, so that unauthorized party on insecure networks can't read it. Now, what does that mean? That means you have a virtual private network, I believe, within key organizations, including the state of Illinois, Veterans Affairs, and the Department of Justice. Now, I'm quite sure there are many good people in the various arms of the justice, but I don't concede or extend that belief or faith to the members of the LGBT community in the United States Marshal Service, FBI, Bureau of Prisons, Office of Justice Programs, which does the tracking, drug enforcement agencies, which would be looking after Chapo, I guess, and the United States Attorney's Office. Now, when you go before a court in the United States, Jason, you are probably looking at an outcome determined by the United States Attorney's Office, which is a member of DOJ Pride, right? So I don't know, other than the fact that the Department of Justice with Christine Marcy set up a prisoner transportation system that uses artificial intelligence to distribute rewards or withhold privileges. I don't know that that is not bring justice into compromising justice, because presumably every day, like 125,000 or 150,000 prisoner flights a day, they're flying around the United States and abroad with people like members of the Aryan Brotherhood. And what I would say is you have an extremely well concealed, very scary organization, criminal organization within the Department of Justice that can put your name on the list for a death pool treatment, where merely these people would say, who are betting, well, I didn't kill him, I just bet on the time he died or she died.
Yeah, right.
Now, going back to, you were outside building number 7 on 911, and if you follow the story there, let me back up there. So these people who have taken out patents for global time stamping and fiber optic links, etc., historically go back to some brilliant researchers at what was known as Standard Telephone and Cables, that I believe pioneered and actually invented the fiber optic links. And that was the technology used in the first transatlantic fiber optic link, called TAT8, Transatlantic Telephone Link number 8. And that was laid in 1988 by British Telecom, French Telecom, and AT&T, where British Telecom's contribution to that was funded through NM Rothschild and Sons Limited. Now, that was 1988, which means Victor Rothschild, who was Churchill's point man through World War II and subsequently, he was still alive because he died in 1990. But I believe what that allowed the people who would one day form the Federal Bridge is they could sell seats on the Federal Bridge, which would give you real-time access with no latency to the master clock at the National Physical Laboratory in Teddington for what is called death betting.
Wow.
Now, if you look at building number 7, and I'm an expert in explosives, so I could have thought of ways of bringing those buildings down. Ramzi Youssef said after the 1993 bombing, and he used 100 pounds of atomized aluminum powder, and he's squatting in ADX Florence. I think his cell neighbor used to be Timothy McVeigh until Christine Marcy had him executed in 2001, presumably because she didn't want him to blow the whistle on the plan to attack America on 9/11.
Or to say anything about his involvement in Oklahoma City is very possible as well.
Well, and did he act alone? No, of course he didn't act alone. If you look at the facade of the building, the Murrah building, you can see there's probably one truck bomb, and that would be, the shock and awe thing, because no one else would think. But if you look to the left at the facade of the Murrah building, you'll see a much deeper intrusion into the building, which looks like was a bomb in, these scumbags, they put it under the daycare center.
Yeah.
They like to kill, right?
Well, right. I think they not only enjoy or have no feelings at all about killing, I think they value the psychological impact of, extreme violence and how most people cannot tolerate it or even really mentally process it. So when something like this happens, I think it leaves the normal person in such a state of shock that perhaps they are psychologically susceptible to suggestion or impression, or you can sort of tell them, oh yeah, 19 guys flew planes into buildings, and that's what happened. David, let me bring you back for 1 second to Jonbenet Ramsey, because it's something that we haven't heard about for many years. This took place in the late 1980s, 1988 or something like that. When was Jonbenet Ramsey killed?
Oh, Christmas Day, 1996, and I
96.
actually believe she was killed at midnight on Christmas Day, 1996.
So
and
why do you think
stamp
there's been a lot of talk in the past week or so about this guy who has come forward, and we've got new details here about Gary Oliva, the man who confessed to killing Jonbenet Ramsey. What do you think about this?
Well, I hate to judge from impressions, but I look at this guy and I think he's got the flavor of Willie Picton. The guy who's got a double life sentence in Canada for second-degree murder, which is absurd because second-degree murder, you're basically an accessory. Now, looking at that without thinking too hard about what kind of background, do you think he's capable of writing a 3-page ransom note that says, well, we're familiar with law enforcement countermeasures, and I want $118,000? I mean, it's ridiculous. It's a bit like saying the brother killed Jonbenet Ramsey. He's 10 years old at the time.
Yeah.
She's been tasered, garroted, sodomized, and her skull's fractured. So now, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, with regard to the skull fracture, it's funny. The more we go over this material, the more things come to mind. But when you look at this closely, David, the skull fracture is so perfectly, oval. It almost seems like it would be made by a hammer and tremendous force, because look at it's a perfect oval cut. We're seeing blood here on the outside of it, but it's almost as if some sort of a oval drill bit were used. It almost doesn't seem...
Well, it would be round if it was a drill bit, but my point is that the timing of the wounds and images and damage to that little girl is only... There's a term in death pool called spot fixing, actually, in sport. It's like when you kick a ball into touch, or when you serve a double fault at tennis. And that's basically a description of a fraud, in gambling fraud, because people can throw 1 point without changing the overall result. But for example, in India, there was major scandals because millions of dollars were being bet through spot fixing by nobbling the players, right? Now you've got the ultimate
doing what
players,
to the players? Bribing them?
Nobbling. I mean, nobbling a horse, that's a British term. Nobbling a horse, you feed it some kind of food that makes it not run very fast and that sort of thing. It's a way of arranging an outcome. That Howard Lutnick invention, interactive wagering on event outcomes?
Yes.
Right. So Howard Lutnick was the chief executive officer of Cantor Fitzgerald, who very conveniently was outside the building, but I think very likely betting on the body count of his colleagues in the building, where 658 of them died.
Well, David, the reason I'm leaving this really grotesque image here is because, we've heard that Jonbenet Ramsey was garroted, strangled, and tasered. And these things seem like torture. You could strangle someone for several seconds or maybe even a minute, and they'd remain alive. You could taser them a bunch of times and they would remain alive. I mean, that constitutes torture, but certainly let's assume for a moment that this injury was caused by a hammer. This certainly does look like the shape of a head of a hammer, and an adult male striking the skull of a young child that hard, maybe it could make that kind of hole in it, and it would certainly seem like that would be instant death.
And that's your point. The word instant is very important, you see, because if I'm right, what Serco has done, because it runs a prisoner escort service in the United Kingdom, even though they tried to nail it because of alleged fraud in declaring the prisoners were being delivered to trial or back to prison. And what apparently was happening, Serco was charging the taxpayer or the government for prisoners that either had never been in prison, were dead, were overseas, or back or jail. Now, it's very interesting, the particular police force that said that they found no evidence of Serco's senior directors being aware of this, which begs the question, were people below Christopher Hyman aware of it? And he resigned. The police force that ruled on that was not the Metropolitan Police or Scotland Yard, it was the City of London Police. And the City of London Police, they go back to Roman times. And
Isn't the City of London... Sorry, David. I don't know if you and I have discussed this, but other guests have told me that the City of London is an extraterritorial thing that's not actually part of the United Kingdom, but its own sort of domain.
Yes, you're absolutely right. And I think it's got 778th mayor. And people believe there was a mayor and the guilds ran back to Roman times. It's an immensely powerful organization that I think when the dust settled in New York, the center of financial world returned to London where it had been for hundreds of years. And that's one of the motives of picking out the targets in New York. But just going back to Jonbenet Ramsey, I think that was the coup de grace. That was the spot fix time of death. I think someone was taking images of that, and on the bottom would have been a timestamp. And the timestamp would have said, or could have said, let's say that they wanted the person to scoop the pot who bet that this child would be killed at midnight on Christmas Day of 1996. Very symbolic time for Christians and just people generally, of course. I mean, it's an international crime, and it's a cold case, Jason. You and I can solve it, I believe, right? Because I think that was a Con Air SWAT team deployed by Serco using timing signals from the National Physical Laboratory clock distributed through fiber optics. Now, and this is really interesting, because if you want to build what Rockefeller said, a transnational government of world bankers and an intellectual elite, it's a bit like a friend of mine in the UK when I ran my artificial intelligence operation, and I was trying to get my software guys to work, together. And they were wonderfully brilliant, talented people. But I tell you what, Jason, it's like herding cats, right? They're all prima donnas. They're all prima donnas and they're all nerds. And I don't program a computer. I just knew what I wanted them to do, and they did it eventually. But it's extremely difficult to manage a brilliant software team. They're very creative. And almost inevitably, when they've coded it, they think they invented it. I invented the system, the first deductive computing machine, and they implemented it. So, no problems. But
David,
now with this...
Sorry, not to digress, but I'm sure you've seen this photo. You brought up Rockefeller, and when we speak of 9/11, I think we must look at this. I've long suspected Newsweek of being a deep state information, sort of a co-opted news source. But this is from April 3rd, 1967, and it's David Rockefeller talking about a new era in banking. And I believe this has to do with the construction of the World Trade Center. It's hard to see in this particular image, but he's sitting. This is I believe below him here is the construction site where the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center would ultimately stand, and we can't really see it in that image, but his watch is set to 9/11.
Wow. Now there you are. Discovery again.
Interesting.
Well, actually, it's not that. Well, yes, I suppose it isn't. But it would be 8:55. But yeah, you're right. 9. Now, isn't that interesting, Jason? Mm-hmm. And again, that sends shivers up my spine, because I don't know if it was set that, if it's photoshopped or something like that, but I find there are no coincidences.
Yeah.
Anyway, so he says somewhere that the world is ready to move to a transnational government of world bankers and an intellectual elite. Now, my software guys in the UK, they're a technical or an intellectual elite, and they're very difficult to get together, moving together, right? Eventually I pulled it off, but it's very time consuming. So if you want to put an intellectual elite together, there are only a number of mechanisms by which you can do that. And one is, well, the four basic levers: sex, fear, greed, or power, right? So if you take the teaching or faculty members of Georgetown University that included Bill Clinton and Hillary Clinton, or Chicago, University of Chicago, Barack Hussein Obama, and the University of Chicago medical centers, which would have included Michelle Obama and Hillary Clinton, both being intellectual property lawyers. What do you need to do to keep those people organized in the sense of the Jerome Lemelson patent, which distributes rewards or withholds privileges based on prisoner or parolee behavior? And of course, if it can be prisoners or parolees, it could be citizens who've never been to jail in their lives.
Right.
So what I think the United States and the United Kingdom and the Five Eyes countries faces is an internal, deeply buried racketeering organization that is putting people's names who give them trouble up on a list for death pool betting, where the people who place the bets can put their hand on their heart and say, well, I didn't kill him. But they're actually putting money in a pot operated by Serco and its investment banker, N.M. Rothschild, that can, I believe, on 911 build up to tens or hundreds of millions of dollars. And 10% of that, I think they call that the VIG or vigorish, is available to the bookmaker to pay off the people who deliver or spot fix the time of deaths or the body counts. And that, maybe if I could just take a riff on what you and I are doing, I pray and hope that one day our loyal supporters, and I'm immensely grateful for the people who provide donations and support, but I think we're reaching a period now, Jason, you and I, where we need to go viral to send a message to the vermin that are executing these hideous crimes on humanity, that we, the people, are coming for them. How to say, we have an educational and an entertainment role. And I think I told you that I've created a company, Reverse CSI Scripts Limited, up here in BC. And I'm working on a script at the moment and storyboards so that we can introduce to student groups or production companies. And I know your reservations about, I don't intend to go to Hollywood, incidentally, but I believe there is an enormous pent-up appetite for the truth in respect to these major crimes.
Absolutely.
People know who killed Jonbenet Ramsey. I think I do. I think that ransom note is an extraordinary document that ultimately points to the people who had custody of the various patented devices that would have allowed them to develop or produce a snuff film with a timestamp on it that indicated the precise moment that little Jonbenet Ramsey died. And I venture to suggest that will be midnight on Christmas Day of 1996, because such a photograph with an authentic timestamp sent to the directors of Lockheed Martin, who signed off on that bonus check,
right,
might have tempted them to stand down when someone, including Serco's shareholders, approached them and said, look, we would like access to a couple of your patents for an event that we're organizing on 911. And one of those patents would be that time division multiplex system of transmitting or bit spreading a message through a network like the Federal Bridge. So only the receiver that was authorized to receive it, remember that's the Federal Bridge Certification Authority, was able to do a little front running on betting on the movement of shares on 911. Because if you know that the plane is about to hit the North Tower, right in the midships of Marsh McLennan, where everyone, when first of all, it doesn't happen very often, but if a plane hits of 100 tons, hits a building with 200,000 tons of structural steel, no matter where it hits on any floor, there will be people away from the immediate blast who will survive from that floor. No one in the Marsh McLennan, I think they had 8 floors, survived, which tells me that they had explosives arranged within that building so that no one from Marsh McLennan would survive to explain what happened. Because a very large component of these attacks is you have some high-value targets, which obviously would be senior people in the insurance industry, that you want to remove to return or distribute or destroy the competition to other companies. Now, at the top of the North Tower, there was a company called Aon Corporation, right? And Aon Corporation headquarters was Chicago, which is Obama land, right? And after the attack of 9/11, I think they lost about over 200 people, and lost, of course, is a euphemism. Those 200 people were murdered and targeted, right? The headquarters of Aon Corporation was moved to London, which is which was the old financial capital of the world until New York started to impose some of its territory. And after 9/11, the world capital, financial capital, went back to London. Over to you.
David, there's so many questions that are coming to mind as you're telling us all of this. So, you know, this dark overlord, who I've brought up a couple times, has been releasing information related to lawsuits having to do with insurance. And of course, we've heard about the betting that was going on, or not the betting, but I should say the money that was made from you know, short selling of stocks related to 9/11. And there's so many questions running through my mind right now. We're almost out of time to ask and answer them all, but yeah, there's a lot going on with this dark overlord releasing information, and it all seems to be related to lawsuits and things going on with insurance companies. We've heard a lot about Marsh McLellan. But of course, so David, the title I had given today's episode was that Zulu time links the Jonbenet Ramsey murder and the destruction of World Trade 7. Is there a way that, you know, before we close out for today, can you kind of wrap this up for people and explain to us how the Zulu time links those two things?
Right. So Zulu time is used by the military, and it's the equivalent of UTC at the Greenwich meridian, you know, where the Eastern Hemisphere is split. Now, what happened in the United Kingdom is we, if I may say so, pioneered. My father was an antique clock collector, and if ever you go to the UK and you're interested in that sort of thing, go to the Greenwich Maritime Museum, and you'll see the 8 prototypes of marine chronometer built by a man called John Harrison, who ultimately won the Admiralty Prize, Longitude Prize of, I think, £20,000 or 20,000 guineas in the late 18th century, and that was a huge amount of money. And he built a marine chronometer that could be mounted on gimbals inside a ship, that could sail from Bristol to Jamaica and back, which would have a journey of 3 or 4 months, I believe, losing no more or less than 5 seconds, which is an astonishing technical achievement. And so the British pioneered precision horology, if you will. And when eventually, I believe, at the with the railways in the 1848 period, they had a standard time in the United Kingdom called Greenwich Mean Time. Basically, the United Kingdom then drove precision timekeeping around the world on the All Red Line, right, which connected up the old colonies. The All Red Line was basically a copper cable laid under the sea, the first one being the link between Ireland and Newfoundland, laid in 1858, and then in 1988, along comes the fiber optic link, which is a high bandwidth link that gives you the possibility of even greater precision. What I'm saying, or what I'm alleging, is that this British company, Serco, engages in global time stamping of high-value target and mass casualty events around the world, which gives betting pools, often set up in luxury hotels, the opportunity to place a bet on the time of death of a particular target without actually being accused of arranging the killing of that target. And so what I'm very interested in on 9/11 is why that picture of the attack on the Pentagon has a date and a timestamp, of 12th September 2001 and 1737-19. So there is another picture.
Yeah, I'm looking for that. I was trying to find the one with the timestamp.
If you look under images as opposed to video, just click on images anyway, it's September 12th, 2001 and 1737-19. Now, that's interesting because September the 12th, 2001, of course, would be the date in Queensland in Australia, where one Bill Clinton, I think, was squatting, watching the scene live from the Sheraton Port Douglas Hotel. Now, God forbid that he was placing a bet, but I wouldn't put it past him on the time that the people inside the Pentagon's U.S. Navy Command Center died. Now, Americans should understand that there was a duty officer by the name of Gerald DeConto, and the elite members of the Pentagon's U.S. Navy Command Center, about 125 of them, they were all murdered at September the 12th, 2001, 1737-19, where the people placing the bets, I suggest, included someone in the Sheraton Hotel in Queensland in Australia, or possibly the Sheraton Dubai Creek Hotel in the United Arab Emirates, where I used to live. There you go, September the 12th, 2000.
How do we know that somebody didn't just add this?
Well, we don't. We know nothing about photoshopping and so on, but it's up to them. It comes back to my theory. The people in the Pentagon's U.S. Navy Command Center died a wrongful death, right? So we have grounds because of spoliation of evidence, because it wasn't September the 12th, 2001. It wasn't 1737-19. So whoever adjusted or manipulated that frame is either hiding something or revealing something. And my assertion is whoever had custody of the patented devices that allowed you to put that global timestamp on that image, we can make an aggressive inference of guilt that they are involved in the wrongful deaths of the people inside the Pentagon. And then we find, of course, people who had custody of the clock that would have allowed you to make that date stamp is our friend Serco, with custody of the National Physical Laboratory clock in Teddington, where their shareholders include the government of Saudi Arabia, right, which is kind of significant, and their investment banker includes N.M. Rothschild.
I feel like this date has to have been added after the fact because, I mean, this is a security camera in Virginia or, Langley, wherever the Pentagon is.
Yeah, but the security camera would have been slaved or hooked to the Federal Bridge, right? And whoever was using the Federal Bridge at that particular moment and its fiber optic links to orchestrate the attack or synchronize the attack or coordinate the attack on America that I believe was intended to decapitate America, depending on where you were, that image would have been available to anyone in the Sheraton hotels who was hooked into the network. So there are people in the world where it was September the 12th. Right? 1737-19 is the time that it would have been in the United Arab Emirates, where Osama bin Laden is alleged to have had dialysis at the Dubai hospital with advice and cooperation and communications with members of the CIA, which is presumably including Joanne Isham, who was in charge of clandestine operations for the CIA for years.
Now, David, we're just about out of time, and there's going to be a lot of things for us to discuss on our Friday show, which of course people can see by joining us on patreon.com/reverse CSI storyboards, or of course patreon.com/crowdsource the truth. I just want to raise a couple of points. We've got some of our viewers have been asking questions throughout the course of time we've been speaking here, and we're sort of out of time to address all of those, but there are some interesting ones. That's Worrisome, You Better Run on YouTube is reminding us that the Lindbergh baby kidnapping was somehow used to trick people into turning in their gold for dollars to try to, I don't know, do we see any connections between the Lindbergh baby kidnapping and the Jonbenet Ramsey killing?
Well, I think the Lindbergh baby was a kidnap, whereas the ransom note and the ransom note was written presumably by the person who knew that there was a couple of men killing the little girl, right? So it's very bizarre. Now, let me just make a point about that. When you have evidence of a child of tender age being kidnapped, apparently the procedure is the FBI is supposed to be immediately alerted because it's highly likely that the child is going to be taken interstate. Right? Now, that didn't happen because I think the communication systems with the Boulder police had been hacked. And Linda Arndt, that's the woman with the googly eyes, right?
Yeah.
Who gets that? I know who killed Jonbenet Ramsey and that sort of thing. I mean, she's beyond spooky. I think she's on some mind-altering drug or whatever. But, you know, I also believe that she's a very frightened human being.
I wonder if she's still part of the police there in Boulder, Colorado.
I think they booted her out. Right?
Oh, really?
Mm.
Why did they do that? Too crazy looking on TV?
There's an evidence trail because what was this doing? This woman was actually in the home, the Jonbenet home, and they were waiting for some kind of call from the kidnappers, etc. And evidently she'd been told that the child needed to be found, so she instructed the father to go and look, right, again. So he found the door to the basement jammed. Well, why the hell didn't she look? She's the cop, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, there's so many strange things about it, David. I think we're going to need to carry on our conversation on Friday when we reconvene. There's one other thing here that That's Worrisome, You Better Run is talking about here. That's Worrisome says that, I guess, his or her father taught him or her this when the father was democided over his work on the Dorito stealth bomber after 33 years of working in a vault at the Fort Worth bomber plant, Convair, General Dynamics, Lockheed Martin.
Well, I don't know the point that's being made, but I do know that those 4 big defense contractors on the Federal Bridge have been forced to take proteges through Christine Masters' Small Business Administration, where the proteges get loans and they're not allowed to be redlined on the basis they might otherwise have been disadvantaged by virtue of their ethnicity or their faith or their sexual orientation. So basically the American intelligence system or counterintelligence system is in a state of total collapse. And I think it's ridiculous that the President of the United States has to sift through the inputs from 18 intelligence agencies, all falling over themselves, all having ego trips and budgets, etc. How do you get any intelligence out of 18 intelligence agencies? It's worse than herding cats. Over to you.
Well, yeah, I'll tell you, David, more troubling to me is that the very likely incoming Attorney General is a self-admitted outside advisor to the CIA, and as we dig into his background more, it seems he may have been directly involved in Operation 40 and some of the most sinister activities of the CIA over the past 50 years. So
maybe you could ask Joanne Chisholm if you can come on the show, and we'll give her a little bit of online waterboarding.
I will certainly try it, David, but for now I think we're going to have to close out today's episode. I want to thank you for joining me. I want to thank all of our generous Patreon sponsors and remind everyone that we will be back on Friday. Please join us on patreon.com/crowdsourcethetruth or patreon.com/reverse CSI storyboards. I will see everyone later today at 5 p.m. when Charles Ortel will be closing in. Thanks for watching, everybody.
Thank you, Jason.